Snow lashes across the shattered tree line. Men crouch in frozen foxholes, rifles pressed to their chests, breath turning to ice before it leaves their lips. The forest is quiet, but it's the kind of quiet that feels wrong, the kind that presses on your ribs. German artillery has been pounding this ridge for hours, and everyone knows the next barrage is only minutes away. Here's the question that cuts through the cold. You're surrounded, starving, freezing. What choice do you make? A flare streaks overhead. Figures move in the woods. The siege of Bastogne has begun. The road to Bastogne doesn't begin in a forest. It begins with a miscalculation. By December 1944, Allied commanders believed the German army was collapsing. Intelligence reports pointed to exhaustion, fuel shortages, and units held together more by fear than discipline. The front line stretched thin from the North Sea to the Swiss border, manned by soldiers who expected the war to be over soon, maybe weeks. But in the forests of the Ardennes, Hitler had been quietly assembling something no one expected. A concentrated strike force meant to punch a hole straight through the Allied front and seize the port of Antwerp. If it worked, it would split American and British armies in two, derail the Allied advance, and force a political crisis. The Allies had been caught off guard before, but they had never faced the scale of what was about to hit them. The attack fell hardest against inexperienced American units holding what was considered a quiet sector. At dawn on December 16th, German artillery roared across a 40-mile front. Panzer divisions surged forward through fog and forest, overwhelming outposts, cutting roads, and swallowing entire regiments. Within hours, chaos rippled through the American lines. Command posts lost contact. Maps no longer matched reality. Reports came in of tanks appearing miles behind friendly positions. Nothing was stable. Bastogne, a small Belgian town surrounded by rolling fields and dense woods, suddenly became the hinge of the entire front. 6 major roads ran through it. Lose Bastogne and the Germans could move armor freely toward the Meuse River. Hold it, and the offensive would choke on its own. Momentum Eisenhower needed someone to block that road. Network fast, the 101st Airborne Division, already worn out from months of combat, had been resting near Rams. They weren't supposed to be fighting again so soon, but trucks began lining up before dawn. Paratroopers were shaken awake and told to pack what they could. Many didn't have winter gear. Some grabbed only ammunition and a blanket. Within hours, they were rolling toward a front no one fully understood. On the way, the convoy kept halting. Refugees streamed past in the opposite direction. Farmers, children, old men pushing carts piled with blankets and the last food they owned. They carried stories: German tanks in the woods, American units overrun, villages burning. The 101st kept moving. When they reached Bastogne on December 18th, they found a town already buckling under pressure. Military police were trying to organize stragglers from shattered units. Wounded soldiers lay on floors inside churches and cafes. Officers shouted orders that vanished into the roar of artillery. The paratroopers spread out and dug in. Foxholes hacked into frozen ground. Roadblocks built from carts, rubble, even dead horses. Machine gun nests positioned to cover every approach. Bastogne wasn't a fortress, but it could be turned into one. Then came the worst news of all. The German advance was closing around them from every direction. By December 20th, the 101st Airborne and several armored and artillery units were completely surrounded. No roads in, no roads out. What made it worse was the sky. Low clouds and blizzards grounded Allied aircraft. No supply drops, no air support, no medical evacuation. The defenders were on their own. Inside the circle, food was rationed to a few mouthfuls a day. Ammunition ran low. Field hospitals overflowed and morphine froze in its vials. Some soldiers wrapped their feet in burlap to keep their toes from turning black. Fires were banned. Smoke meant death. Every hour, artillery fell somewhere. And yet the German timetable started to falter. The roads were clogged. Fuel trucks were running empty. Tank crews were sleeping in their vehicles. Every minute Bastogne held forced the German offensive to slow. The decisions made at Bastogne only make sense when you understand what command believed was coming next. Heavy armor, moving fast, trying to punch through the fog and winter. For now, the men on the ground didn't know any of that. They only knew the circle was tightening, and the Germans were preparing to crush the town. The turning point at Bastogne doesn't come with a single dramatic charge. It comes with pressure, steady, punishing, unrelenting pressure, building toward a breaking point. By the morning of December 23rd, the defenders had been surrounded for 3 days. The perimeter was stretched thin, and every company was holding more ground than doctrine allowed. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Some machine gun crews counted out their last belts bullet by bullet. Artillery units saved shells for emergencies, firing only when a German push threatened to break the line. And then the sky opened. The clouds that had smothered the Ardennes finally pulled back, revealing a hard, pale winter sun. For the first time in nearly a week, the distant rumble of engines approached from above. Not bombs, but supply planes. C-47s crossed the lines in long, steady strings. Paratroopers watched the pilots fly low under fire, risking everything to drop ammunition, food, blankets, and radio batteries. Some crates landed behind German positions, others smashed into trees, but enough made it through. Morale shifted almost instantly, but the Germans reacted too. They knew what clear skies meant. Allied armor and air support weren't far behind. If Bastogne wasn't crushed soon, the entire offensive risked stalling, so they increased the pressure. Villages like Marvy, Champs, Neff, and Flamierge turned into battlegrounds. German infantry launched coordinated night assaults, slipping through forests and ravines to test the line. Paratroopers fired flares into the air, revealing silhouettes moving through the snow. The fighting was close, violent, and often blind. December 24th brought the most coordinated German push yet. Just before midnight, the quiet cracked open. Artillery pounded the southern sector. Mortars fell like steel rain. German troops surged toward the village of Marvy, supported by tanks, a rare concentration of armor so close to the perimeter. The 327th Glider Infantry held the line, alongside elements of the 502nd Parachute Infantry. Their foxholes shook under the bombardment. Buildings caught fire. Snow turned black with smoke. When the tanks appeared through the haze, everything hinged on anti-tank crews who had only a handful of rounds left. Men waited until the silhouettes were so close they could hear the engines grinding. Then they fired. One tank lurched, burning. Another reversed, trying to escape. Infantry scattered under machine gun fire. The Germans pulled back, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. They couldn't afford to lose armor on terrain this unforgiving, but the message was clear. Bastogne wasn't a quiet siege anymore. It was now a race. On Christmas morning, the snow fell softly across the battlefield. It looked peaceful from a distance, but up close the ground was chewed apart by artillery and pocked with shell holes filled with frozen water. Inside the town, medics worked through the holiday without pause. Chaplains held brief services in cellars. Paratroopers shared whatever rations they had left. Pieces of chocolate, strips of frozen bread, sips of cold coffee. There were no grand speeches. No heroic declarations. Just a sense that they'd survived another night. But as dusk fell, German units massed again. By the 26th, the German timetable was cracking. Fuel shortages were severe. Commanders argued about where to commit their last tanks, and intelligence reports warned that an American armored column, George Patton's Third Army, was moving fast from the south. If the Germans didn't crush Bastogne now, they risked being caught between the defenders and an approaching relief force. So they launched their final, desperate assault on the western and southern flanks. It began with artillery. Then came infantry pushing through the woods west of Hemrula. Behind them came tanks, Panthers and Panzerors slogging through the snow. American artillery fired their last remaining shells. Machine gun crews waited until the Germans were nearly on top of them. Anti-tank gunners held their fire until the barrels glowed red with heat. The Germans kept coming. A Panther broke through the tree line and rolled toward an American position. One paratrooper, out of ammunition, freezing, half delirious, grabbed a discarded bazooka. Another man handed him a single remaining round. He fired from 20 feet away. The shot hit. The tank exploded. Moments like that weren't heroics. They were necessity. The German assault stalled. Infantry pulled back. Tank engines growled in retreat. Not because the Americans were stronger, but because the Germans no longer had enough fuel, ammunition, or time to continue. Bastogne had held just long enough. By late afternoon, American scouts reported something unbelievable: the distant engine roar of approaching Shermans. Relief forces from Patton's 4th Armored Division were breaking through at the village of Airdennes. The siege was about to end, but the fight wasn't over. While the defenders of Bastogne were fighting hour by hour, Patton's 3rd Army was executing one of the fastest, coldest, and most brutal winter maneuvers of the war. The shift north from Lorraine had begun days earlier, a logistical contortion that required fuel rerouting, road clearance, and units marching through ice storms so fierce that vehicles froze to the ground overnight. The reality often gets lost in retelling. Patton didn't just turn north. His entire army group pivoted like a machine under strain, pushing forward through conditions that would have stalled most formations. Traffic jams stretched for miles. Tank crews slept in their vehicles, engines idling to keep them from freezing. Supply officers rationed fuel by the gallon, yet the column kept moving. Patton's goal wasn't to crush the German offensive wholesale. It was simpler and more urgent: crack a hole in the ring around Bastogne before the defenders ran out of ammunition. By December 26th, his lead elements, Combat Command R of the 4th Armored Division, reached the outskirts of Airdennes, a village only a few kilometers southwest of Bastogne. But reaching the village wasn't enough. Between them and the besieged town stood German infantry dug into the snow, supported by anti-tank guns placed to cover the narrow roads. The weather worked against both sides. Snowdrifts slowed movement, but they also masked approach routes. Visibility swung wildly. One moment clear enough to see a tree line, the next swallowed by whiteout conditions. As dusk settled on December 26th, the Shermans of Team Abrams rolled toward Airdennes. The village looked abandoned, but the moment the tanks entered, German anti-tank guns opened fire. Shells clanged off armor plates. Machine gun bursts tore through the snow. Infantry from the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion dismounted and fanned out through gardens, alleys, and barns. The fighting was close, almost claustrophobic. You could hear men shouting in German and English across 20 yards. A barn went up in flames. An American half-track burned in the street. The Shermans kept moving, not because they were invulnerable, but because stopping meant becoming a target. Behind them, engineers worked under fire to clear obstacles blocking the road. By 4:50 p.m., the last German defenders in Airdennes were pulled back. The road to Bastogne lay open, but the worst challenge was ahead: a narrow stretch of icy roadway between the village and the perimeter. It's one of those scenes you can picture even without a photograph. Shermans rumbling forward in low gear, snow blowing sideways, trees rising on either side like dark walls, and then, through the fog, the faint outlines of dug-in American positions. At first, neither side recognized the other. Both had spent days fighting off anything that moved. A machine gun on the American side opened fire, sending bursts down the road. The Shermans halted, turrets swinging. A moment of confusion. Then someone shouted the right challenge. Someone else shouted the right password, and then it clicked. Paratroopers climbed out of foxholes waving their arms. Tankers popped out of hatches. For the first time in a week, isolated defenders and rescuing armor met in the open. It wasn't a dramatic Hollywood embrace. It was relief that showed in small ways. A cigarette offered through a hatch, a medic passing news back, a tank crew tossing cans of rations to starving soldiers. A common misconception is that the siege ended the moment the relief column broke through. The truth is quieter and harder. The fighting around Bastogne continued for weeks. The town was no longer isolated, but German forces kept attacking, trying to cut the corridor back open. Artillery still fell. Patrols still clashed in the woods. Men still died in the snow. But the psychological shift was unmistakable. The defenders were no longer out of time. The Germans were. The northern thrust of the German offensive had stalled. Fuel shortages worsened, command disputes intensified, and the 101st Airborne, bloodied, frostbitten, exhausted, had held the key point long enough for the tide to turn. The ring had broken. The siege was over, but the battle and the winter were far from done. When the road to Bastogne finally opened, the men who had held the perimeter didn't cheer. They didn't celebrate. Most were too numb to process what had happened. They had been living moment to moment for a week, counting artillery shells, rationing rifle ammunition, fighting off frostbite, and waiting for the next attack to fall out of the trees. Relief didn't erase any of that. It just meant they could breathe without wondering if the next breath would be their last. Medical teams moved through the lines as soon as the corridor opened. What they found was grim. Frostbite cases were everywhere. Noses blackened from cold exposure, fingers stiff and swollen. Men who hadn't felt their toes in days. Some couldn't walk. Others had been operating on pure adrenaline, only now realizing how damaged their bodies were. Field hospitals filled instantly. Surgeons worked through the night, treating shrapnel wounds, concussions, shattered limbs, and infections that had set in during the siege. Many of the wounded had gone days without proper treatment. Some hadn't eaten more than a few bites of frozen rations. A few had been holding bandages in place with their own belts. Inside Bastogne, the townspeople emerged slowly from cellars and barns. They'd hidden for days under a constant storm of artillery. Food was scarce. Water was a luxury. The town itself was half ruined. Roofs collapsed, windows blown out, walls cracked open from shelling. Civilians moved through the streets in silence, stepping around burned-out vehicles and horses frozen stiff where they fell. The Americans shared what they could. Chocolate, cigarettes, blankets, and even though they had little to spare, they weren't conquerors. They were fellow survivors in a town that had nearly disappeared under the weight of winter and war. With Bastogne no longer isolated, the German timetable finally hit its breaking point. The entire Ardennes offensive had been built around momentum. The planners expected their armored spearheads to seize fuel dumps, roll past Bastogne, cross the Meuse, and force the Allies to the negotiating table. Instead, they found themselves fighting village by village, tree by tree, losing men and equipment they couldn't replace. The siege of Bastogne didn't destroy the German offensive by itself, but it choked the flow of troops and fuel at a critical moment. It forced panzer divisions to divert into costly fights around the town. It slowed everything, and slowing the offensive was fatal. Once Allied air power returned with clear weather, the sky filled with fighters and bombers hitting convoys, bridges, and supply depots. Every hour the Germans lost at Bastogne multiplied the pressure they felt across the entire front. And when Patton's forces linked up with the defenders, it sent a signal. The Allies could pivot faster than Germany could attack. From that point forward, the Bulge wasn't a breakout. It was a retreat waiting to happen. The paratroopers didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as men who did what they had to do, hour after hour, in a place so cold that their memories froze into something hard and sharp. Some carried guilt, over friends lost in foxholes, over the wounded they couldn't drag back, over civilians who didn't survive the bombardments. Others carried pride, quiet pride, the kind that doesn't need speeches. For many, Bastogne became a private benchmark. If they could survive that, the hunger, the cold, the artillery, they felt they could survive almost anything the war threw at them afterward. But there was also a shadow. Many of the men who held Bastogne would later admit that the cold stayed with them for years. Winter storms triggered memories. The smell of diesel and cold air brought them back to those foxholes. They never forgot the silence between barrages. And here's the thing, stories like Bastogne only make sense when you sit with the details. The desperation, the endurance, the thin thread of time stretched across frozen fields. Even after the corridor opened, the 101st Airborne didn't leave Bastogne. They stayed in the snow-covered fields, still dug into foxholes because the front hadn't stabilized yet. German forces continued launching counterattacks into January, trying to cut the relief route or squeeze American forces back into the town. For the men on the line, nothing felt different. There was no warmth, no new supplies beyond the bare essentials, no rotation to the rear. The cold tightened its grip. Artillery still landed without warning. Patrols went out every night, slipping between trees, checking for enemy movements in forests that now felt haunted. Relief didn't mean rest. What it meant was this: the mission had changed from survival to endurance. Commanders worried that morale might crack now that the immediate crisis had passed. But the opposite happened. With the worst behind them, the paratroopers dug in with a kind of stubborn confidence. They had endured the siege. They weren't about to give up ground now. Meanwhile, the German side was unraveling. Fuel shortages worsened. Officers struggled to keep units coordinated. And as more Allied armor poured into the region, the offensive lost its shape entirely. What had begun as a bold thrust toward Antwerp had become a slow withdrawal under constant pressure. By mid-January, the German salient created by the Ardennes offensive began collapsing inward. Snow-covered fields that had once been battlegrounds were now littered with abandoned vehicles, wrecked tanks, and the remnants of supply convoys that had run out of fuel miles from their objectives. Bastogne stood at the heart of that collapse. Holding the road network had done more than delay the offensive. It forced the Germans to fight on American terms. Every day the town remained in U.S. hands compounded the strategic failure unfolding to the east. Historians would later argue about the Ardennes, the planning, the mistakes, the intelligence failures. But on one point there's broad agreement. The defense of Bastogne didn't just hold a crossroads. It held the fragile line between chaos and recovery during one of the most dangerous moments of the Western Front. And that mattered. The civilians of Bastogne carried the scars just as deeply as the soldiers. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Families returned to homes that had lost walls, roofs, or everything. For years after the war, some cellars remained exactly as they were during the siege. Beds of straw, broken lanterns, jars of frozen water, and scratches on the walls from restless hands marking the days. American veterans returned in the decades that followed. They walked the same roads, stood in the same forests, and remembered the week when the world shrank to the width of a foxhole. The town never forgot them. Monuments rose. Trees were planted. Museums were built, not to glamorize war, but to remind anyone passing through that a place so small could shape events so large. And for the men who fought there, the memory wasn't a grand monument. It was a feeling. The cold in their bones, the weight of frost on their helmets, the breath that froze before leaving their lips. The siege ended. The war moved on, but Bastogne stayed with them. What lingers about Bastogne isn't the gunfire or the smoke. It's the silence between the barrages. The moments when men sat in holes carved out of frozen earth, wondering if what they were doing would matter by morning. The siege reminds you that war isn't shaped only by generals or grand strategies. Sometimes it turns on a handful of exhausted soldiers holding a line no one expected them to hold. A crossroads on a map becomes a test of will. A week of winter becomes a measure of what people can endure when everything around them is collapsing. And here's the quiet truth. Nothing about Bastogne was inevitable. Not the defense, not the relief, not the survival. It happened because ordinary men kept going long after reason said they shouldn't. History usually moves in sweeping arcs, but every now and then, it narrows to a patch of forest, a frozen field, a road choked with snow, and the people standing there decide which way the story will turn. That's what Bastogne was. On Friday, we meet the machines that raced to save these men.